Hello there, how are you doing? Now in this video we're going to learn about static properties and methods. Okay, so far all the properties and methods were linked to this specific instance, right? So two different instances could have two different values for the same property. For example, we have customer. The customer is the first customer. We could create second customer. Let's call it second customer, and let's give it a name of Jen, and let's change this to Jen. Okay, so we still have the same class, right? This class has the ID, first name, last name, email. It's all same. However, every time we instantiate, based on the instantiation, we get different result, right? So we can say var_dump, and we can var_dump the second customer. Okay, let's give it a try. Okay, so the second customer we created with Jen, with the surname of Dingle and the email of Jen. So, and we still have the previous one. Okay, so we can create, class remains the same, properties remains the same, but based on the instantiation we get different result. But what if we want certain methods or properties linked to the class itself rather than to the object, right? So anytime, even if you instantiate certain properties, you want to stay linked to the class itself. So PHP allows us to have multiple properties and methods linked to the class itself rather than to the object, because so far what we have, these properties are just related to the object instantiation. As soon as you instantiate, they change. What if we want to have something static, right? So we're going to cover that here. Static properties and methods. So let's go to customer class, and let's say we want to have some kind of the ID system. Let's say last ID. Okay. So let's create a variable on top of property, and then we call it, we make it private static. Okay, so this is how we create a static property, a method. Okay, so you use static keyword. Okay, so let's say last ID, and let's set it to 0. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here is, when we instantiate this new customer, the ID is supplied, right? So what if the ID is not supplied? So in that case, what we can do is we can refer to the last ID and increment it. Okay, so every time a new customer is added and the ID is somehow not supplied, then we, based on the last ID, we increment by 1. Okay, so that's how we maintain the ID system. Before the first name, this ID thing, let's comment this out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a simple logic here. If this ID, the one that we're getting from arguments, okay, if that is null, then what I would like to do is I would like to point to this ID, our property, and then set it to self. Now this is how you access the static properties, okay, using the self and double colon. Okay, it's very important. I'm trying to point to this property, but because it is static, I can't use this. Because it is static, I have to use self. Okay, so that's the difference. Okay, so if ID is null, if null value is passed, then I take the ID, put value to this ID, and this value will be the last ID, right? Now last ID is currently sitting on the 0, so we increment. Okay, if it is null, we increment, and that becomes the ID of this one. Now also, else what happens is this ID equals ID. So if it is not null, then what do we do? In that case, if it is not null, if something is passed, then that's good. So we take that ID. That ID is whatever is passed down, that will be assigned to this ID. And then again, if, again we need another check here if this ID is greater than self last ID. So if it is greater than that, then what we do is self last ID, set that to the current ID. So for example, if instead of 1 2 3 4, for example, one customer comes and give the ID of 10. So in that case, we take the highest one. Okay, if ID is greater than the self last ID, so last ID would be, let's assume it was 1, but if somebody or user come supplying the ID of 10, so in that case, if that is greater than this last ID, then we set that last ID to that ID. Okay, so if 10 comes, then it will have the value of 10. Now the next time if somebody comes with a null, then this 10 becomes 11 and that will be assigned to that user. Okay, so it's a basic logic, you got it. The main point here is you use static using this static keyword, and you access static with this self double colon. Okay, so to see this in action, why don't we create another accessor? Okay, so let's create another accessor. Because it is private, we can't access straight away. What we can do is we can make another function. Now the method public static function. Okay, this is a static function. Okay, so this will return self last ID. I forgot to give it a name, get last ID. Okay, so public static function get last ID, and it will return the self, the static property last ID. Okay, awesome. Now we can try accessing it in init.php. Okay, so init.php, I want to access the get last ID, right? So there is a difference on getting the static property. You can use the regular way, for example, like this. Okay, so var down, we can do it the regular way, such as first customer, and we want to get last ID, right? Now this is not going to work because it is a static method. We can't use the arrow, instead we use this double colon. Okay, let's save this one and let's give it a try. So press ID integer 0, so we got the ID of 0. Let's comment this out. Let's try on the first customer. Let's say we don't supply the ID. Let's see what happens. Null, give null, and then let's give it a try. In init.php, let's create some more customer. We have first customer, we have second customer. Let's say second customer have null. Okay, the first customer has the ID of 1, second of null, and let's create one more. Let's name it third, and then let's give it 5. Okay, ram. Okay, so we got 3 customer. So what you can do is first customer. Okay, so we instantiated. Now we can access the get last ID. This is the method we used, right? Public static get last ID. Yep, because it is static, we don't use arrow, we use double colon instead. Okay, so there is another way as well. So this way is reference it using existing instance, right? Now the next method is also there of accessing static property, and that is reference it using class name itself. Okay, so this way what you would do is, what you're trying to get the static property of belongs to this class customer, right? So you can directly refer to the class itself. So what you can do is customer, and you can use double colon and then get last ID. See, so this is another beauty of static properties. You don't need to instantiate as well. You can directly reference the class and invoke here, and you will see this sort of pattern everywhere in Laravel framework. All right, so now that you know how to work with static properties, let's have a look at it in the browser. Let's see what we get. Fresh. Let me comment this out. It's all this. Comment it out. Okay, so we instantiated the customers and we try and get the last ID. Awesome. So fresh. Okay, and we don't see anything. Okay, sorry. This one shouldn't be equal. This should be double equal, right? If it is equals to null, right? Let's give it a try. Okay, so we see 5, 5 is. So the last ID is set to 5. Why don't we comment this out as well? Why don't we comment this out? And let's see. Let's save it again. Let's see. And as you can see, 1. The last ID is 1, as well as the first customer's ID is 1. So give null. Okay. Let's leave null. Okay. Obviously, it increments. For example, let's say, let's try this one. Second customer. So the first one, let's say, let's give it 1, and then the second customer, let's give it null, and we should see 2, right? So let's see this one. So the first one is given the 1, so that's fine. Now the second one is not. It's not given anything, so it's given null. So that function should increment to based on the previous one. So it should have 2. Let's give it a try. Refresh, as you can see, it's 2. Okay, so that's how it works. The key here is you can create static properties and methods using this static keyword. Okay, and you access within the class using self : you can refer to the class itself without having to instantiate and all this stuff. You can even go directly. Okay, so this pattern you will see all the time in Laravel. For example, you can refer to the model and : you can use create method to create new instance and save to the database. Okay, so all that stuff, now that you know static properties, it will be easier when you work with frameworks like Laravel. All right, so this is it. I'll see you in the next video, and in the next video we're going to learn about namespaces. All right, see you in the next video. Thank you. Hello there, how are you doing? Now in this video we're going to learn about namespaces and this use keyword as well. Okay, so if you have two classes with the same name, PHP wouldn't know which one is being referred, right? That's common sense. Obviously it would be confused. So to solve such issue, PHP allows us to use namespace keyword. Okay, so namespace is kind of like a path in file system. For example, bookstore / domain / customer, it's like that. But the difference is each section of namespace is separated by this \. Okay, so it looks a bit weird because normally you would use in file system like bookstore / something / something, right? But namespace is this way. You do it this way. Okay, so it's kind of like paths in the file system. However, before we use namespace, one thing to note is that even though namespace and the file path will usually be the same, this is not mandatory. Okay, this is not necessary. As a developer, you can enforce the namespace. So what do I mean by that? You will see right now. Okay, so let's do that. Let's use this namespace. The first thing we want to do is let's begin by moving these two classes that we have, book and customer. Let's move them in a folder directory here. So let me create a new folder and let's call it domain. Okay, so domain, book and customer, and let me drag them inside. Okay, now when you do that, if you have any open tabs, make sure you close. Just say don't save because it's already moved there. Okay, so we got the init here, that's fine, and then we've moved these two files to classes inside domain. Great. Now if you try to access this, let's see what we get here. Refresh, require once, failed to open, no such file or directory. That was expected. Now let's go there. Now what we can do is we can add namespace here. So this file, we're telling PHP that this file is in this namespace. Okay, so we specify that. As a developer, we have control. It doesn't have to actually match the directory structure. Let's go ahead and let's add namespace. So what namespace you want to use? Let's say bookstore. Okay, that makes sense. And then let's call it its domain. Okay. By this, PHP will understand anytime we want to refer to this book class, it is in the namespace of this. Okay. Now we could go crazy and add anything. Okay, so that would work still, but obviously this doesn't make sense, right? So just make sure the namespaces make sensible, so it's obviously easy to understand. Okay? Same as book, the customer also is in the same namespace, right? What we're saying is these two classes are in the namespace of domain, so bookstore domain. What you can do is, now that we have specified the namespace, you can go to init.php and on top you can use them. So how do you use them? It's pretty straightforward. That's what I was talking about, using the use keyword. Yeah. What we do is we say use, this is a special keyword, and then bookstore domain, this is the namespace we give. Now in that namespace, because both of these class have this namespace, right? Now what we're trying to get is we're trying to get the actual class book, actual class customer. So both of them are in this namespace, so that's fine. Now we need to go one step further and specify the class name as well. So we do that like so. So both of them in the same class name, and then we get the actual class and we use. This is how we can use. Okay. Now let's copy paste and let's do the same for customer. Awesome. Now we have the namespace in place and we can use them using this use keyword. And you see this pattern all the time in Laravel framework. Okay, so once you understand this, once you go through this, you'll have a great time in Laravel. All right, so it should work now. Let's give it a try. Refresh. Now we manually assign it like so. Now later we're going to use the autoloader. Okay, so until we do that, let's fix this one because this has moved to domain, right? AIN. Okay. Okay, so it has moved to domain slash, so we just change that. Now let's give it a try. Bookstore domain book not found. Okay, I didn't save the file before, so just make sure you have saved your both classes. Okay, and then you can see that. Let me also get rid of this at the moment, and instead we can see the var dump. That's appropriate. Let's put it back to first customer. Awesome. Let's give it a try. As you can see, this object is in this namespace, everything, and we have this namespace added in front. Now if you wouldn't use this pattern, what you could also do is, let's comment this out. What you could also do is, because we're trying to instantiate this book class, right? So here we are instantiating new book. Now instead of using like so, we could even do this bookstore slash domain slash book as well. Let's save this one. Let's give it a try, and as you can see, it still works. Okay, but obviously this is very difficult, so we simply use this use keyword and specify like so. Okay, so that's how it works. Now one more thing, what if you had two similar class names? You might have another folder called library, and that would also probably have book.php. So in that case it would be conflicting, right? So what you can do in such situation is you can use this as keyword as well. Okay, so if you had, for example, let's try on this one. If you had another library folder and you had book.php and you had to import on the same file. So in that case you could do something like as and then say my book, okay, something like that. So you can use this as keyword to personalize, give it a different name so that it doesn't conflict. This would work, okay. So for example, what I could do now is I can take this my book. Now instead of instantiating this book, I can say my book, okay. Now let me save this one. Let's go and refresh. As you can see, it still works. So this is namespace. I'm sure you're pretty much clear with namespace, okay. Now in the next, let me put it back the way it was, okay. Save this one. Let's refresh, check it again. It works good. Now in the next video we're going to move on to autoloader, okay. Instead of manually loading like this, imagine you have 100 classes. In a bigger project you would have, so you wouldn't like to write like this 100 times, okay. So I'll show you autoloader in the next video. Thank you.